Well, the settled 20th century position, well, somewhat settled. S.N. Haskell. S.N. Haskell, in his little magazine, The Bible Training School, May 1903. And at this point, we have the proof text method fully developed. Well, in many other matters, a plain command is, thou shalt not do this thus, and there is no alternative but to obey. The partaking of the flesh of the swine is one of the questions which the Lord has definitely settled. And then he goes on, and the scavengers like buzzards. The inmates of the sea are also divided into two classes, all those that have both skins, fins, and scales, and scavengers. He goes in to quote Leviticus 11, not only the hog, but also the birds and the fish. Before the flood, the beasts were divided into these two classes, and that's an important point there. No one who, in defiance of the plain instruction given in God's Word, continues to eat swine's flesh can hope to be saved when the Savior comes. Well, that's putting it pretty straight. But he's also got the shellfish included in here, the shrimp. Okay.
So it's a matter of salvation now.
For behold, the Lord will come with fire, and with his chariots, and with a whirlwind, to render his anger with fury, his rebuke in flames of fire.
Amen.
Those eating swine's flesh shall be consumed together. Isaiah 66. The eating of these things which God has forbidden is very grievous in his sight. He compares them with smoke in his face. Isaiah 65, verses 1 to 5. Well, I think that was probably the majority position of most people, most Adventists in the 20th century. That you can't, this is a test question. You will be destroyed for this sin. What about selling these hogs? I'm going to go back now. We're finished about the journey, okay? We're going to come back and look at it from a late 20th century perspective. We still got the two divided camps, okay? But that's what I call the 5 stages. By S.N. Haskell, the thing is all put together. Now let's go back to hog selling and take a look at some of these statements. Here we got the Battle Creek Bible class, February 11, 1868 review, and you've got these questions coming up. Another course, this Bible class, they discussed tough issues. Another correspondent proposed the following question: I hardly acquiesce in the decision of the Bible class on the question of hop raising. Now, hops is for beer, okay? And would respectfully offer for their consideration the following: is the practice of raising and fattening swine for the market morally right? 3 arguments can be urged in his favor of raising swine. This is the discussion. These are the 3 arguments we can argue for raising swine. 1, the hog is a scavenger and therefore useful. 2, pork raising is a source of profit. 3, people will have it anyway, and why shouldn't we supply it? Against this reasons, it was argued, 1, that the hog is a scavenger only when permitted to run at large, but he's usually kept in a foul and contracted sty. 2, the question of profit should not be allowed to influence us in matters of right and wrong. Otherwise, the liquor seller could defend his traffic. 3, the sole question then is it injurious to such a degree that we act consistently in furnishing it to our neighbors? Instances were mentioned in which it has been thrown into the face of Sabbath keepers that they would not use pork themselves, knowing its tendency to disease, yet would not hesitate to sell it to their neighbors, to spread disease among them. Resolved, that we deem it inconsistent for a Sabbath keeper or health reformer to raise pork, to sell to his neighbors, while he argues that its use is a source of disease and is therefore refuses to use it himself, and we would discourage such practice among our people. So this becomes quite an issue. The next month, March 17, 1868, apparently the question now is agitated. The Battle Creek Bible class again, they're discussing it again. No man who is unwilling to sacrifice his hop yard or his hogs or any business which should prove to be not consistent with the spirit of the third angel's message is worthy of the kingdom of heaven. That's what some of the people were saying. You can't get rid of your business, you're not worthy of the kingdom. And then, well, this is a response. This is one man speaking back. Okay? A man by the name of Smith, Adolphus Smith. No man who is unwilling to sacrifice his hop yard or his hogs has any business. It's unworthy of the kingdom. This is a strong position. Swine raising is no doubt more objectionable than raising hops for beer. Okay? Now we're going to come again, March 24, the next week. Oh, here's James and Ellen weighing in. Now, what's the old fanatical woman going to say now? She's responding to Smith and some of the other radicals, that is Adolphus Smith. Hops. Now, this is James and Ellen. They very seldom ever write together. Because they're not always agreed, for one thing, but they easily write their own stuff. Hops. In answer to many inquiries, this is James and Ellen both writing, we would say that we believe there is a business for Seventh-day Adventists to enter upon for a livelihood more consistent with their faith than the raising of hops, tobacco, or swine. So she's getting into this, they're getting into this very softly, but they're stating their principle. This is not a good thing to be into. And that we would recommend that they plant no more hops or tobacco fields, that they reduce the number of their swine. Oh, dear Ellen, come on, get in the faith, woman. I mean, the woman is just not a hard-fisted type of person. That's all there is to it. We would recommend that they plant no more hops and tobacco fields and they reduce the number of their swine. They may yet see it duty, as most consistent believers do, to keep no more. See, they know what the ideal is, but they're not going to be pushy. We would not urge this opinion upon any. Much less would we take the responsibility saying, plow up your hop and tobacco fields and sacrifice your swine to the dogs, like Adolphus Smith apparently was saying. While we would say to those who are disposed to crowd hop, tobacco, and swine growers among our people that they have no right to make these things in any sense a test of Christian fellowship, we would also say to those who have these miserable things on hand, if you can get rid of them, get them off your hands without great loss, consistency with the faith of this people would suggest that you get rid of them. That you should get rid of them as soon as possible. Ellen White is not a hard-fisted type of person, but she knows what the ideal is. She took people where they are. And, this is a problem because I just, of course, now we've had 160 years of this experience, I have a hard time sometimes, you see. In some of our churches in the South, some of the elders are tobacco growers. And I don't suppose it's for medicinal purposes. We're having now the great renaissance in wine. and Adventists own good wine property in many parts of the country. This becomes an issue in some of our churches because they're selling their grapes to the wineries rather than to Welch's. I myself was in an island in the Caribbean, and I went scuba diving with a certain gentleman who made his living diving for shells. And he says to me, he took me into his shop, and he said, look, I make money on these shells, but if I saw what's inside the shell, good Adventist gentleman, then I can make a living. And he opened up his freezers, and there's all them conch and other big snails that the people were buying for food, you see. And he asked me if it was wrong. What would you say? This is a real question.
Yeah.
And I imagine it's a question in some parts of the Philippines.
Mm-hmm. Tobacco mostly.
Yeah, well, okay, tobacco. But
Yeah.
and
There are fishermen too in this South Central.
I have my own gut level feeling. I don't have a lot of time to get off on this. My own gut level feeling is, what I told the guys, look, brother, that's between you and God.
Mm-hmm.
You've got to make that decision. I can't make it for you. On the other hand, I'm not sure I want a tobacco grower to be one of my elders. Because I feel a little more strongly about tobacco, knowing what we know about tobacco, than I do about shell. I just told him, I can't make that decision for you. Obviously, his conscience must have been bothering him. And I wouldn't mind saying it. Knowing what we know, probably not the best thing you could do with your time. You know, I mean, if you consider these things unhealthy, or what do you want to sell them to your neighbor for? You know, there's a lot of things that could be said, but when it comes right down to it,
Isn't that the main thing, though? We want to make up other people's minds?
yeah, we want to make up
We don't.
other people's minds, and there's these people out here, they want to find somebody who will justify their position. I'm not going to justify their position.
It's a struggle.
They're going to have to live with God, not me. And but we don't like this area. We want to make it clean. Let's get rid of these people. If they can't shoot their hogs, nuts with them. On the other hand, I can't imagine. Maybe there's Adventist hog farmers somewhere. I don't know. Anyway, we'll just leave the question as an historical point of view. And once again, I want you to note Ellen White's moderation. She was not at the edge of people and doing access. Now, she would say, don't start up a business like that. She's talking to people who already are in business like that. Now, this really takes on some strange twists and turns. I was in Japan holding workers' meeting, and the question came up. I'd never seen it before. It's in the church manual. That if you sell tobacco, or you sell wine, or pork, or I suppose even dog food with pork in it, that you can't belong to the church. It's in the manual. I'd never seen it before. So they wouldn't let people who work in grocery stores or gas stations belong to the church. Well, I told them, I don't think that's what it means. I think if you own a liquor store, that's what it means. Or you own a tobacco shop, that's what it means.
Restaurant that serves beer?
Yeah. And of course, is that different from being a bartender? These are issues that are not clear. Because if you knocked out everybody that ever worked in a restaurant, I mean, you know, not ever, but is working in a restaurant, or is working in a grocery store, or a gas station, or any other place where these things might be sold, you might have a much smaller church membership. Particularly after you kicked out all the faithful Adventists who happen to be working in those places.
At the same time, lots of nurses and doctors working in the hospitals during the Sabbath, and this is not an issue everywhere.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, it's been the biggest exit, though, because they get used to treating Sabbath.
Yeah.
We can get back on that one. We're not going to get up there. Yeah. This, it's permissible because it's an act of kindness. You're doing good. But the question comes, like in the state of Texas, that if you work 12 hours for 2 days on the weekend, 24 hours, 2 12-hour shifts, you get 40 hours pay. So a lot of Adventists
Yes.
have 5-day holiday every week, but they work Sabbath and Sunday.
Mm.
Now, can we disfellowship them? No, because they have found the proper loophole. This is medical work. How can they face God with this issue? May need to be raised, but in the end, they've got to make their decision. You see, you can't set down some kind of a Mishnah or some kind of a Talmud that nails down every possible offense that you're going to, you know. For me, if I was a medical person, I would certainly feel that if my daughter, she has to visit people in their homes, I would take my shift on the medical field. But try to get out of it if possible. Try to get a job even in the medical field, because Sabbath is sacred, and when you begin to work on Sabbath, even in good things, pretty soon you get more and more careless. And that's just a way out for physicians, and I've seen too many of them leave through that route.
Pastors too?
Yeah, it becomes an ordinary day. Is it legally okay? Yeah, it's legally okay. Is it morally the best thing you can do? You see, and here we're dealing with a principle. Whether you eat or drink, do all to the glory of God. And so the principle, I would say, for lifestyle issues is what can I do to do the most glory for God? Now, these people that my daughter visits, they have to have their shots. They're bedridden. They don't live without it. I mean, yeah, okay. But she has made her own decision. She's not going to work the 2 12-hour days and have 5 days off every week.
Yes, this is a problem.
You know, so these kinds of things we can talk to people about, but they have to make their own decisions.
Some people work and then donate what they make.
Yeah, that's another one. And the early Adventists, that's when they worked for Adventist institutions, that was factored in. But they weren't paid that day.
That's what I
In fact, they
advise.
factored in the extra pay for the other days, but they worked free that day.
Yeah. That's what I advise to my nurse members in my church.
Yep. Well, here we go. Review and Herald, February 13, 1872. Is it right to raise swine to sell? Answer: we are disposed to leave this question to be answered by Romans 14. Let every man be fully persuaded in his own mind. We cannot consent to bind people's consciences in matters concerning which we have no direct order in the Scriptures. Not a bad position. I think the only position, not the position some would take. Oh, oysters. I love the topic of oysters. Oysters, the slimy little creatures in the tidewater. Oysters, something my parents loved, but I could never eat, even when I ate raccoons, squirrels, frogs, and big snails called abalone. I ate all of those things, but I couldn't eat an oyster. Because an oyster has got a big black sac, and you can't get it out. It's the intestine. And so when I was in the Army, I ate everything that moved. I still remember liver day. Nobody could stand liver, so they all piled it on my plate, and then I sat right in the corner, everybody just dumped their liver off on my plate, until one day I got a big vein down my throat, I yanked the whole thing out. But I mean, I loved hearts and liver and kidneys. Oh, kidneys, man, I love kidneys. Yeah. One day I came home and I said, "Mom, what's for dinner?" And all of a sudden I sniffed, and that, boy, it smelled like she'd been boiling urine. Apparently the cow forgot to pee before they killed him. That was it. This is before I was an Adventist. But oysters were out. I wouldn't touch an oyster. But Ellen White had no problem with oysters. Okay, this is a grocery list, and I want you to know you don't lie to your grocery list. Okay? One of the most highly credible documents in history is to find somebody's orders of what they want to buy. Okay? And this is 1882. Do you know that 1882 is 19 years after 1863? Okay? This is a note to her daughter-in-law. Mary, if you can get me a good box of herrings, you know herrings are dried salted fish, fresh ones, please do so. The last ones that Willie got are bitter and old. If you can buy cans, say a half dozen cans of good tomatoes, please do so. We shall need them. If you can get a few cans of good oysters, get them. Now, I'm telling you right now, she was not buying those for cat food, okay? No. Adventists were eating oysters when they'd given up pork and other shellfish. Now, these people got their brains plugged in. Okay, here's another one. Ellen White and oysters. Arthur White, dietary witness of the Ellen White household. Now, Arthur White was not one to say things about his grandmother, that were difficult. This is his response to this paper that he wrote. Reports that Ellen White ate oysters no doubt stem from an incident I have heard my father relate, in which she was traveling, was very ill, and could hold nothing on her stomach. Someone suggested that oyster broth might settle her stomach, so she took a few sips. Come on, Arthur, I bet you she ate the bowl. Arthur is trying to protect her, but he still has to admit that she did it. You see? No! These people ate the stuff. I really don't think oyster soup would settle your stomach, okay? Nice try, Arthur. But he did admit that his grandmother ate oysters. Well, we got a grocery list, that's all we need. Uriah Smith, according to his diary, returning from an overseas trip, this would be the 1890s, terminating with a voyage across the Atlantic, and its discomforts to a Seventh-day Adventist diet, sat down to a good bowl of oysters. Thank you, Brother Smith. Just right on, brother. Now, here's another one. According to family tradition, Uriah Smith liked to say that God did not make oysters so good if he did not mean for them to be eaten.
What kind of argument is this?
Here's one here. 1901. A Brother Healy writing to Sister White, September 1901. I've been collecting oyster statements for years. My memory goes back to the time when oyster supper was served Sunday evenings on our campground to get money from the outsiders. Oh, try that for fundraising at your camp meeting this year. See what happens. My memory goes back to the time when oyster supper was served Sunday evenings on our campground to get money from outsiders. Here we are. A diary of a conference president and an evangelist, 1892. His name is Hottel, H-O-T-T-E-L. And he was really fascinated with oysters, I'm telling you. Now, let's see. Open it. Okay, the problem is sometimes that yellow stuff you mark things with, yeah. I'm going to have to remark this one here because the yellow is faded so bad I can't read it. Anyway, he's holding evangelistic meetings, and after the meetings, sometimes pastors go out and have a little snack together. They did. We eat some oysters. This is 1892. Another one down the track, January 28th, we had oysters cooked in a kettle, and etc. Anyway, oysters were a great Adventist food, which raises the question, are they unclean? Now we have the Review and Herald of August 14, 1883, answers by W.H. Littlejohn. Littlejohn himself was quite a legalist, okay?
1883.
So we're not dealing with a liberal here. Heading of White oysters. Are oysters included among the unclean animals of Leviticus 11? And do you think it wrong to eat them? That's the question. Answer. It is difficult to decide with certainty whether oysters would properly come under the prohibition found in Leviticus. It would, however, seem from the language as if they might be. If they do, then there would be undoubtedly some natural reason for the discrimination against them. Some have thought that such a reason is found in both their habits, in the manner of feeding, and the circumstance that is necessary to eat them just as they are found in nature, the native state, without separating them from their viscera, meaning guts. Anyway, this is the answer of a man who's noted to be a legalist. And his real answer is, I don't know. I don't know if these things are included, but it seems like they might be. He doesn't even use the scales and fins thing.
Yeah.
What was the date on that?
That was August 14, 1883.
Who was writing here?
What's that?
Who said this in the Review and Herald?
August 14, 1883.
Who said it, though? James White?
No, that's W.H. Littlejohn. L-I-T-T-L-E, John.
I didn't like it.
Well, when did we stop eating oysters? I'm not sure. But I do know
No record.
that John Harvey Kellogg, very influential man of the church, in 1891 comes out against them. He writes a book called The Household Monitor of Health. The Household Monitor of Health, and I'll read a couple of sections from this. Pages 134 to 136. We have investigated the oyster from a microscopic standpoint and find its juice to be literally swarming with myriads of germs wiggling and swimming about. The Frenchmen eat snails, which we are accustomed to look upon with loathing, but these snails are vegetarians, living upon the vine leaves, and certainly in the matter of diet are much superior to the slime-eating oyster. The oyster is one of the lowest of the scavengers. The scavengers at the top of the water have the first pick of all the decaying substances which find their way into it. Lower down, other scavengers make their meal, but the crumbs from the tables of all the other scavengers drop to the bottom, where they find an oyster stuck in the mud with his mouth wide open. The hard brown part of the oyster is its excretory organ, liver, kidney, spleen, etc., all combined in one. Its diet is so bad that it needs a big liver to keep it alive. In addition, if additional reason for not eating the oyster is needed, it is found in the fact that a deadly poison known as thyroxetoxicin is liable to be contained in it. Well, somewhere in the 1890s, I think we probably applied the skins and scales rule. I'm not sure when. I I was tracking down, when I was in Australia one time, there was a report that my wife was still eating this stuff in 1894. I know that she was eating fish in 1894, after she stopped red meat. But soon after that, she dropped that also. But I never tracked it down. It really doesn't make any difference. But somebody said that she was still eating shellfish at that time. And life is too short to track down all of these things. Closing remarks on the topic. By the way, the question always comes up with some of my seminary students. What if a pig is raised in a stainless steel container, which is totally sanitized and only fed grain? Well, to me that's beside the issue, but my one thought on the topic is my grandson, he says, look at Grandpa, that hog is pooping on his food and eating it. I still got the nature of a hog even.
Yeah.
And there's other physiological reasons which the physiologists give. The real question is this a sin or is it unhealthy?
This is the question, yes.
Okay? That's a question raised by John Brunt in Spectrum Magazine, Volume 11, Number 3, Unclean or Unhealthful, An Adventist Perspective.
What year?
I don't have the year. It's Volume 11, though. That's
Recent, really.
recent, it's
20th.
late 80s, early 90s.
Mm-hmm.
Somewhere probably in the 80s. Because I remember when it came out because I objected to it. Now I agree with it. The more I studied history, the more I changed on this particular topic and how I needed to present it. Many Seventh-day Adventists typically emphasize two distinct ways in which one may err with regard to diet. One is a violation of health. And then he talks about unclean Leviticus 11 is seen as a violation of God's law and is sinful in a way that the mere lack of regard for health is not. In other words, we have two different levels. If you're just being unhealthy, that's a higher level. If you're eating pork, that is sin. Big sin. Okay? He says there's problems with this. It's first, inconsistent. And second, the New Testament explicitly abolishes distinctions between clean and unclean. Yeah.
Oh, I think he passed by. Somebody was peeping here, I don't know.
Paul also emphasizes the cleanliness of all things in Romans 14. He did his dissertation here. I don't agree on that because Romans 14 is not about clean and unclean. It's about being vegetarian and not vegetarian. It's eating animals at all.
Yeah, Romans 14.
Another topic here.
Anyway, he goes on to quote it. I'm going to use his argument. He goes to Mark 7, thus he declared all foods clean. Then he goes to Romans 14, I know and am persuaded in the Lord Jesus that nothing is unclean of itself, but is unclean for anyone who thinks it is unclean. Adventist expositors have often sought to explain these statements. According to this interpretation, the New Testament allows the distinction between clean and unclean foods in Leviticus to remain binding. First, he rejects that. The clean and unclean, and I would have to agree. The New Testament rejects the distinction between clean and unclean. Ceremonially, there is no distinction. We all agree on that, I believe. First, it should be noted, in the first century, no one considered Jewish food laws to have anything to do with health. Nor is health an issue in any of the New Testament passages cited above. And that's true. Never is it cited as a health issue in either testament. They're cited as clean and unclean, not health and unhealthy. The relationship of diet to health was simply not an issue in first century Judaism or Christianity. Ritual purity, which directly affected one's relationship to God, was the issue. excluded them from the temple. It made no difference whether the impurity resulted from eating forbidden foods, giving birth to a child, menstruating, touching a corpse, or failing to wash in the prescribed manner. All of those were equally unclean. No extant Jewish writing from this period directly concerns Jewish food laws and health. Jesus and Paul must be understood within the context of the issues of their time. The issue Jesus addresses is not health, but a ritualistic understanding of the nature of religion, according to which food, corpses, unwashed hands, etc. cause a spiritual defilement. Jesus and Paul were not saying that all food is healthful, but that all food is clean. It is not able to bring ritual defilement. Thus, this is probably another reason for Paul's emphasis that all foods are clean, in order to break down the imposing barriers that separated Jew and Gentile, the entire distinction between clean and unclean, which was so basic that Jewish thought had to go. Thus, while the New Testament rejects the distinction between clean and unclean, it is not speaking to the issue of health. Should a qualitative distinction be made between eating such foods and other unhealthful dietary practices? He says, no. There are two major and closely related reasons, however, why we have often continued this line of interpretation in spite of its inconsistencies. First, we have been unwilling to acknowledge that Ellen White contributed to our health practice and have maintained instead that every facet of our practice is biblical. Second, we have wanted to have specific biblical proof texts to support each point of practice. What then are we to do in the light of the difficulties which our traditional use of Leviticus 11 brings? Three specific suggestions follow. First, we should accept without embarrassment the teaching of the New Testament that nothing is unclean, recognizing that the issue of health was not a factor in New Testament discussions. The time was not yet right for God to reveal the principles of health reform to his people in the first century. Instead, other issues such as the internal nature of true spirituality and the unity of Jew and Gentile in Christ must come first. Second, the difficulties connected with our use of Leviticus 11 suggest that we must do our theological homework and firmly establish the importance of health reform on the biblical teaching of the wholeness of man and the value of physical life. The result of such work should be greater rather than less responsibility with regard to health reform, for the emphasis will be on the responsibility to do always that which is most helpful, and not merely avoiding certain food. Thus he's basing it on a principle, do all to the glory of God. You see, this is an issue, like I raised yesterday. You've got a person that's grossly obese and they weigh 900 pounds, or let's just make it more realistic, 450. That's much more serious than, but that's not the way we look at things. Thus, the need for a change is not for a change in our practice. She's arguing the same thing as Uriah Smith did. If you buy into Leviticus 11, you are in trouble if you're making that the basis for your teaching rather than health. But for a clear grounding of our concern for health and scriptural principles, that's the issue. Third, the difficulties attending the traditional view underscore our need to recognize our indebtedness to Ellen White and her health reform vision of 1863. What Ellen White affirms is that in these particular laws, God's original purpose was health. That's what he's saying. This is Ellen White's understanding. That God gave these laws for health reasons. That these foods are especially unhealthful, and thus they should not be eaten. It also follows from Ellen White's discussion of swine's flesh that the purpose of the prohibition for us today is health and health only. Pork is forbidden only because it is unhealthy. That is, it's not some special kind of sin. Violation of health reform is not one kind of sin, and violation of God's direct command in Leviticus, quite another. Rather, the difference is quantitative. Pork is simply more unhealthful than some other meats. Never under any circumstance, Pork is especially unhealthful. It ought to be for these reasons that Adventists refrain from eating pork, not because laws concerning clean and unclean in Leviticus are still binding upon Christians. For the Christian, all things are clean. True spirituality is a matter of the heart, not of ritualistic externals. Well, there we are. Back to Uriah Smith, 1883. Now, we're going to have to go to lunch pretty quick and have a pork chop, I guess. How do we approach this in Bible studies? I do not start out with Leviticus or Deuteronomy. I start out with Genesis. And I start out with the fact that God made us to be vegetarians. Adam and Eve are vegetarians. And I might flip over to Isaiah and show that in the kingdom, do not eat, they'll all eat, even the lions will eat straw like the ox, that God never made people to destroy creatures. But there came a flood. And after the flood, there wasn't anything around to eat. But God said, take into the ark 7 pairs of every clean and 1 pair of unclean. So the distinction was there. And the distinction is there for 2 reasons. Number 1, sacrifice. It has to do with the ceremonies. Because if you happen to kill 1 hog, you've lost your breeding group. No, they weren't to sacrifice them, but after they got out of the ark, where they were to sacrifice, and they were also given permission to eat the clean. Okay? This is before there was ever a Jew. Hundreds of years before there was a Jew, God had divided these into clean and unclean. And, of course, when he gave them permission to eat meat, it's obvious that he didn't give permission to eat the unclean. There was only 1 pair. No, when he gave permission to eat meat, he only gave permission to eat the clean. Okay, how do we tell what they are? I only use Deuteronomy 14 and Leviticus 11 because the same author tells us what he means by clean and unclean. So built into the Bible itself, we have the ceremonial, that is in Genesis, we have the ceremonial implications and the other implications that God never, ever gave us permission to eat. He did give us permission to eat meat, but not unclean, just clean. How do you tell what they are? That's where Leviticus comes in. And once I've done that, I don't have to argue from the New Testament anymore because everything is clean ceremonially, but everything is not healthy. God never ever gave us permission to eat these things. This is one historical study that's changed the way I present a topic. Any questions?
The step between eating what is clean to vegetarianism being seen today as a holier than thou lifestyle. When and how?
Oh, when did that come in?
Yeah.
Probably about the time that the first human was born.
No, in Adventism.
Yeah, it's just built into things that if you're more rigorous, you're better than other people. The problem is, you see, we become proud of our accomplishments, which makes us worse than other people. No, this is built into human nature. What does Ephesians 2 say? That you're saved by grace through faith, not of works, lest any man should boast. No, I'm trying to mention this out. There's something important here. Not of works, lest any man should boast.
Yeah.
Next verse goes on to say that God didn't make us for good works. But Dwight L. Moody, the great evangelist, used to say, if anybody gets to heaven by anything they ever did, we'd never hear the end of it. There's something here, and I think this is what you're after. what I perceive as part of it. And that is that people who do things feel superior to those who don't. In other words, if I'm a vegetarian, I'm better than you.
Yeah.
And when did it come in? About the first time we got vegetarians, most likely.
I mean, in the history of the Adventism, I'm talking about the pioneers. When,
Yeah, I don't know.
When this,
The first Advent, the first vegetarian, probably.
yeah.
I mean, it's built into human nature. There's no history on that. It's just, you got to say, what's human nature? Well, human nature is to think that you're superior if you're doing better. I'm looking over there to see if that's my man. I don't know.
Yeah.
So, go ahead.
Oh. Well, is it in the order now that you're giving it to me? If you say that in the New Testament there is no unclean and clean, there is no distinction between clean and unclean, why is it that in Revelation it speaks about unclean, that are unclean fowls of the air that are in the...
Yeah. Well, you
that's
still have the Old Testament definitions. It still have the Old Testament definitions, but there are nothing that's clean or unclean for you. But still, you go back to the Old Testament, and these buzzards are unclean, okay? But that doesn't mean it's unclean to you. There's nothing you can do by touching your wife when she's menstruating, touching a pot that's boiled hog flesh in it that's going to make you unclean, or touching a football that's made out of pork
leather, skin.
hog skin.
Yeah.
No, that's not going to make you unclean. That's impossible. That distinction is gone. You can still go to church, brother. You can still go to church, but you couldn't go to the temple.
We don't have temple anymore.
I know.
So you're saying the ceremonial uncleanness and...
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. So I don't have to argue all those New Testament texts. Because nothing is unclean. That's an important point.
So no more dancing around Colossians 2, nail it to the cross, forget it, that's it.
Well, Colossians 2, what was nailed to the cross, it wasn't the ceremonial law. Ceremonial law was for us, not against us. What was against us? The penalty of the broken law.
Yeah.
And we've been wrong on Colossians 2 all along. On that part of Colossians 2.
That's the danger of proof text method in Colossians.
In fact, the best translation of that is the English Revised Bible, the one that just came out about 10 years ago. It really makes it clear that the ordinances, the handwriting written against us, are the condemnation of sin. That was what Jesus died for that. You see, really, the ceremonial law, not the unclean and unclean, but the ceremonial law itself is gospel. It's Jesus, the Lamb, dying for us. It was never done away. Jesus said no part of the law would be done. It just got transferred to heaven. Jesus is now our high priest. So we have to move away from that. But the other texts, I don't have to argue from Mark 7. Jesus declared all foods clean. Yeah, they're all clean. Nobody is unclean ceremonially because they touched a pig or a rabbit or a cat or a dog. You see, otherwise you'd be unclean if you touch a dog or a cat. You certainly couldn't preach. So, we need to continue to think these things through, but it's not probably best to use our weakest arguments. I really believe our strongest approach is the first 10 chapters in Genesis. The original diet, God gave us permission, but He only gave us permission to eat what He defined as clean. That doesn't mean they're unclean according to sacrifice. It means they're, He just never gave us permission.
So
And I can only identify them by Deuteronomy.
So if somebody bottom line said, I want to eat pork tenderloins, and I don't think it's a sin, and they presented that to us as a question?
Well, now you're stuck between the tension of whether they're going to go to heaven or whether they can join the Adventist church. And those two things are not the same. Here's one here. What about smoking? Here's Ellen White. Maybe I should take this later. I've got this guy coming for lunch. Come back today. Let's take our end break like we usually take, an hour and 45 minutes, because I'm not sure when my man's going to get here. I think we'll probably be finished on time. But what time would that put us there? An hour and 40?
1:45?
1:45. So have a little longer afternoon today. We had a short morning. So 1:45, and then we'll go to 4:30, and we'll just what was the thing? I was going to talk about.